Hey, how is everyone doing today? It's Tuesday. It's the Slow Earth Report Live. I'm here with Jack Buffington, our advisor, our friend. Teaches supply chain at the university. He runs the supply chain department at the University of Denver. He worked for Molson Coors for years, running logistics and supply chain and all kind of really exciting stuff over there. Welcome, Jack.
Yeah, thanks, Dave.
Cool. Well, I will say, Jack and I spent our entire prep 15 minutes talking about the Baltimore Ravens. We are both from Baltimore. We figured this out like a month ago, and it's dominated our conversations ever since. So
yeah, I'm surprised you're not wearing your Lamar Jackson jersey. It's really disappointing.
I should have. Jack had me speak to one of his classes last week with the precondition that I had to wear the Lamar Jackson jersey because there were some Pittsburgh fans in that class. But that was pretty cool. Jack, tell everybody a little bit about what you do at University of Denver.
Yeah, so I got this great opportunity to start a supply chain program from scratch. So a lot of times when you join a university, you take over somebody else's program, which was really exciting here, is that we didn't have a supply chain program. So once I was done with my corporate gig, this was a great place to land because supply chains were changing really quick. And I had a greenfield to develop what I consider to be a 21st century supply chain program.
Amazing. And so you were at Molson Coors for like over 20 years, right?
Yeah, 20 years. Yeah, not over 20 years. Don't make me that old.
20 years, exactly. And you know, it's interesting because one of the things I said to your class is that when I was in college, I was a marketing major at University of Maryland. And I had a friend that went into logistics, and I was just like, why would you want to do that? Anyway, he's like killing it right now, like running a global shipping company. But the way to make an impact today, if you were to say that, if I were up in front of college kids, it's like get into supply chain, get into logistics, because from a sustainability perspective, that's how you can make an impact. So that was something that I told your class that where I was very, very, very wrong, my 20-year-old.
Well, I was very wrong too. I started off in finance, and then I went into management consulting, and then I went into IT, and then I went into manufacturing and supply chain. But what I found through all the different jobs that I did, they had one common denominator, and that is I like to solve problems through structured processes, and I like to get things done through people. And so if you're the type of person who likes to have really difficult challenges and get them done through other people, this is a great field to be in.
Well, there's nothing but challenge. We're nothing surrounded by challenges for sure. And it's funny because we talk to all these chief sustainability officers at a lot of the big companies, and they all just goes right back to like procurement and supply chain and logistics and like constriction. They'd love to do all these things, but to get it to fit into the mix. So maybe it'd be good. Can you talk a little bit about the book you wrote, Peak Plastic?
Yeah, let me start off and tell you that about 15 years ago, I was running logistics in the Golden Brewery at Miller Coors, which, by the way, is the world's largest brewery. So I was running this huge operation, and I was thinking there's got to be a different way to handle all these problems that we face from a consumer packaging standpoint. So I decided to tell my boss that what is the next move that I want to make is I want to go get my PhD in Sweden because that's the place that's the most environmentally friendly. And he was like, well, what do you mean you're going to do that? I'm like, I'll stay with the company, but I'll just go back and forth every 6 weeks, which he thought I was crazy, and I probably was. But I really thought that supply chains were solving one problem and creating another, and they should really not do that. So I thought I would go to Sweden and figure it out. I did research there on material science and supply chain, and I found out that they have the same problems that we do. And it's how the supply chain works. The supply chain is built to create a bunch of things for people, but it's not been created in order to solve problems to be able to both provide people products at the same time creating a balance in the environment. So this became a really big part of my research, and I think it's a really exciting opportunity in the future of how supply chains can lead to sustainability as opposed to causing the problem of it.
IKEA is in Sweden, correct?
They are, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's just like you think of supply chain efficiency, I think of IKEA and like walking through those warehouses and like just how that works and the spreadsheets involved? Probably a lot more than spreadsheets.
Yeah, but I think the key to that nation is they recycle everything. They reuse everything. They have this term in Sweden called lagom, which means just enough. So it's this culture that's focused on balance between the economy and the environment. And like I said, I thought I was going to find all the answers there, and I found that the answers weren't there, because supply chains are in place to solve problems, but how you define a problem is how you solve it. And so we built supply chains to get you a bunch of stuff, but not to take care of the environment. So my thought is these supply chains of the future need to be able to do both. And there's some really exciting things on the horizon which should allow for that.
What are some of those exciting things? What is getting you excited these days?
So one area I'm super excited about is closed loop systems. And the challenge with closed loop systems is that you have to design a closed loop system from the beginning. So if you think about plastic, as you and I know, it wasn't designed to be reused. So we can do recycling campaigns and we can do all this stuff, and the best we can do is mitigate the problem. But what we have to do is create these materials that are like nature, right? When a leaf falls to the ground, it becomes a part of the food system, right? It's a part of an ecosystem. So supply chains and ecosystems are both systems, but one is closed loop and one is not. So it's really exciting to work with scientists who have these great innovations, but the problem with their innovations are that they're not successful in the current state supply chain. So what needs to be changed, as well as these materials, is how our supply chains work. Because if all you do is create new materials that are sustainable and the supply chain stays the way it is, you won't solve the problem. So this is really exciting for me because I get to talk to people like you and scientists and and tell them that's the end-to-end supply chain which is going to solve the problem.
So when we get into plastics, and again, you wrote a very large book about plastics, where do you feel like we're going to be 10 years from now, 20, where do we need to be? Where are we going to be? Obviously, a lot has to happen in a hurry. COVID has set us back significantly. I know you've done a lot of work with COVID-19 and, some interesting things. We'll get to that in a little bit. But like, where do you feel like we need to be from like a supply chain perspective? Yeah.
So the first thing we need to do is fix we need to put a Band-Aid on the current system that's completely broken. So I think like what you're mentioning is 10 years from now, there will be a material system and a supply chain that will enable these closed loop systems. But the problem is that, as you know very well, what's happening in Asia right now is an environmental catastrophe. And we just can't keep having 10 million tons of plastic pouring into the ocean every year. And then all of the problems that we have with leaching even on the ground. So we have to fix these major problems in the next couple of years to buy us some time for the material science and the supply chain to catch up.
I mean, it's interesting. We talk to scientists all the time too, and it's there's just this issue with creating the infrastructure to produce at scale. And like Braskem, the Brazilian petrochemical company, they have a sugarcane-based plastic that they can run on their normal machines, which has enabled them to scale faster. But still, it's like there's just nowhere near the scale to really make a dent in the problem. There's also lots of environmental sort of trade-offs with that type of technology as well. But it's like this, like an inventor's dilemma. We have all these incredible folks that we're talking to all the time, and with great ideas, we already could have invented the next best material. But how do you get it on machines and produce it at scale and get it where it needs to go? And that's, I feel like, I mean, do you find that as like one of the biggest challenges with like the next best material sort of solutions?
Well, again, I don't think the materials is the I mean, like the materials are a challenge, right? But I think part of the problem with the materials is the fact that when we use the term plastic, we use the term as if it's aluminum. Like aluminum is really one material, where plastic is thousands of different materials with thousands of different properties. Right? So part of the challenge we face with plastic is, for the supply chain standpoint, how we would recycle a PVC is much different than how we would recycle a PET. So we need to have more homogeneity in these materials in their base composition to allow the supply chain to be able to deal with it on the back end. So I'd say that's the biggest problem, is the fact that plastic really is not a noun. It's more of a verb, right? Because it's thousands of different materials that need to be handled thousands of different ways.
That's true. And recycling infrastructure is not working anywhere in the world. You're like 10% on average. But there are certain materials that are getting collected at a much higher percentage, like PET bottles that any soft drink would end up, or bottled water like that. There's much higher than a lot of the other materials, but that material doesn't work for a lot of the goods that are out there. Do you, if you had to meet one person out there, if you had to like bring out your inner sort of fanboy with respect to the plastics crisis, who would you want to sit down with?
We got really close to that before the pandemic. And it wasn't just one person, but there was a researcher in Australia who was going to get a bunch of people together, not a bunch of people, but call it like a handful of people together to meet with a bunch of government agencies in Asia, because that's really the ground zero of the problem, where we could talk with some of these officials about innovation to like fix this, try to create a better closed loop system. And we were going to meet in March, and then the pandemic hit. But I was like so excited because there's these practical applications. I can tell you how these closed loop systems work, and they can be economically viable. But just to shift gears with you a little bit, when I say that the supply chain has to change, today our supply chains are these long-tailed supply chains, which means we're shipping products long distances. And the problem with a material like plastic as a waste material is once you ship it, you've just lost economic potential for solving that problem. So what my research is focused on is community-based supply chains. So what you do is you take the plastic waste at the point of where it's consumed, and you convert it into something useful there before you ship it. And now all of a sudden you have something in these communities, number one, that can lead to economic growth, which is important in the developing world. It's important in places like Baltimore and Flint, Michigan, places that are economically depressed in the United States that I've talked to. So not only are you're basically turning a waste product into a natural resource for places that don't have natural resources. And so what you've done is you've enabled this supply chain to solve the problem by converting it before it's waste, because if you try to ship waste in a supply chain system, there's no way economically to make that viable. So that's the true innovation in our system. And I was so excited that we're going to meet with these officials and explain the numbers of how this can work. And then, of course, the pandemic happens, right?
Would it be like turning it into a construction material, or a brick is like sort of like the lowest common denominator? I mean, you think about like islands, and everybody talks about how do you get the stuff back off of islands, and that's why so much plastic gets incinerated in all kinds of different variations, right? But I mean, like, what are they in Baltimore, in Flint, Michigan, or in Jakarta, outskirts of Jakarta, or in some island nation in Southeast Asia? What are some of the practical applications?
Yeah, so the first step would be to turn the polymer into the monomers. So, for example, for PET, I won't get too technical here, but PET is essentially two monomers: monoethylene glycol and terephthalic acid, right? And so, as monomers, they have industrial purposes for cleaning and surfactant and stuff like that. And so they don't have as much value as when they're combined back together again as PET, but they do have value. So especially in these places that don't have a lot of economic activity, you can take these monomers and sell them on the open market, which is exciting because, to your point, some of these places don't have a lot of economic activity. So you could actually create industrial environments, based on creating these new materials for them.
That's interesting. So you can take PET and turn it into cleaner. I didn't realize that.
Yeah, you can turn it. So basically what you're using in chemical recycling is a process to break the polymer into its original properties. And the benefit of that in comparison to what most recycling programs do is they do something called mechanical recycling, which keeps the polymer as a polymer, but weakens the polymer because basically you're like breaking it. And so you impact the structural integrity of that polymer, which means your yield rate is a lot lower. So you may only get like 30, 50% yield versus in chemical recycling, you're restoring it back to its original monomer. So the yield rate is in the high 90s and stuff like that.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's such a hot button. Chemical recycling is like the worst marketing ever. So advanced recycling technologies, I think, is sort of like, because chemical recycling just sounds horrible. And it's a hot button. I mean, we have Greenpeace and a lot of the activist organizations that are a part of our organization, the Ocean Plastic Leadership Network, that just want to cut off single-use plastic at the tap, and that's their mission. And then a lot of the industrial efforts are rooted in chemical recycling, alternative, and there's so many different types of technology. So we also have some of these technology operators, and it's such a hot button. It's really tricky, but it's like so much, you have a dump truck a trash truck full of plastic going into the ocean, every minute. There's going to have to be a mix of these different solutions. So that's why we like keep this like neutral place and represent all the different solutions. But it's with advanced recycling technologies and there's so much waste out there. Like how else are you going to...
Yeah, so in fairness to Greenpeace, the reason why a lot of people feel this way is because a lot of times people are using pyrolysis, which is just incinerating it, which in a lot of cases, if you don't do it properly, releases harmful gases into the air. And normally this is done in disadvantaged neighborhoods and countries. So it's actually is a negative. And then the other problem with chemical recycling that a lot of these NGOs are talking about, which is fair, is the only way to make it work is to scale it. So essentially what you're doing is you're shipping a bunch of waste to some big factory somewhere, and you're subsidizing it. And so there's really no benefit to the community, right? So what you need to do is scale down chemical recycling. You need to innovate it through scaling it down through the supply chain. So then what you've done is, instead of either polluting the air or taking all the opportunity away from the community, you're purposing the community to solve the problem. So it doesn't have an impact on the environment. It has a favorable impact on the economy, and you can make the numbers work. So that's what I'm really excited about.
There's, to kind of dovetail on that, we were going to do this big, if it wasn't for the pandemic, in December. We would have been in the Philippines, and we would have had heads of the supply chain and CEOs with these waste collector communities, like kind of up to their knees in plastic, sorting. That was the plan before the pandemic. And a lot of the governments over in Southeast Asia have something where they're turning a lot of the waste plastic back into fishing boat fuel, which, in a sense is a closed loop system, as opposed to having to bring new fuel in or having to deal with this waste. But it's also a dirty process, right? So it's like there's just, I guess, so many different, avenues of ways to turn the material back into useful material. And it's just like, what are you most bullish on? Which technology do you feel like has the biggest potential and to work in the cleanest way?
Well, it really depends on the polymer. I like hydrolysis because it's a low pressure, low temperature. So, when you talk about doing something that's community based, you're not going to have a 200,000 square foot refinery with a bunch of engineers and everything. You want to make something simple so that you can actually bring jobs. So doing something at a low temperature and a low pressure is safer to be within a community. So I like that. But there's some plastics that are more challenging to you can't use that approach for.
And, speaking of community and speaking of like what's happening around the world with this pandemic, you've done a lot of work in this space. How has COVID really changed the game when it comes to the ocean plastic crisis in your mind?
It's completely taken all the air out of the balloon. Nobody's really concerned about single-use plastic right now when you're in the midst of a pandemic, right? When you're talking about serving people food in a safe manner. So you have additional single-use plastic and single-use other materials. And then you talk about all the healthcare products related to, testing kits and everything like that is, the momentum that we made as a community, we've lost. And that's the reason why the approach we have to take needs to be based on the economy, because that's what will win once we get control over the pandemic.
I totally agree with the air out of the balloon analogy. What do you give me, like, with respect to the economy, just making it viable to build these circular systems? Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah. So I think the place that you have focused and I've focused is Southeast Asia, because if you look at where the plastic's going in the ocean, it's going there, right? And so how do you help waste pickers? How do you create, a closed loop economy that works for economic development, so that there isn't this false narrative between the economy and the environment? And I think that's the challenge that developing nations face, is that do they focus on their economy or do they focus on the environment? And that's a false narrative that we need innovation to fix.
So to bridge that gap and to make it one and the same.
That's correct. Yeah.
And so can you talk a little bit about the work that you're doing? I don't know how much of it you can talk about. I know you've been doing some masks and 129 billion masks a month coming into the system. And we have no idea how many of those are ending up in the environment, but quite a bit, depending on where you are in the world.
Yeah, I think you just look at what your current municipal waste system is, and then if it's in Colorado, we have the third largest landfill in the country, so obviously they're all getting buried. But in countries in Southeast Asia, we know where they're going to end up, right? They're going to end up in the ocean, and so that's the challenge that we face. And I think it's time right now to look at how do we create a different model of producing these and using them. And I think the biggest challenge is the economic value after they've been used. How do we create value in that? And that's a real challenge.
That is a challenge. Tom Zaki at TerraCycle, he was on last week. They actually have a PPE recycling program they've had for years that they would use in hospitals. It's obviously like scaling. It's good to see some solutions that are being repurposed, that are already out there. Two questions. What keeps you up at night the most about all this? Maybe we've already talked about some of it. And then what are you most excited about?
Yeah, I think what keeps me up at night is maybe going to be a little controversial.
Not the Baltimore Ravens passing game, I'm hoping.
No, not that. The thing that keeps me up at night is the complacency of today's recycling programs, which are very much as good as the enemy of great. So you have your little green bins. You throw your recycling in the green bin and you feel good about it, and you feel like that's all that's being done. Or a consumer product company gets rid of straws, and then we feel like it's fait accompli. Where all we're doing is incremental innovation. We need disruptive innovation at this point. We need game changers. And my concern is that within our culture, and the culture of Sweden, where I went to school, is there's this feeling of lagom, that we've done enough, and we haven't done anything close to what we need to. You mentioned PET recycling is so much better. It's at 20%, right? That's the best we can do. So my concern is that some of these policies that we enact are focused on mitigation, and we're way past mitigation. We need game changing. So that's what keeps me up at night. What really excites me is that my space actually has the opportunity to solve the problem. And the reason why we have the opportunity is because we're the guys who caused the problem in the first place. So if we can focus the supply chain on, it's the same problem solving techniques that cause the problem that can solve the problem. But what we have to say to people in supply chain companies is, now you're tasked with not creating this false narrative between the economy and the environment. And then we say, okay, we're problem solvers. That's what we do. We got it. Let's make this happen. And the more people I talk to, talking to you and talking to people, it's this excitement that we can make this happen. And all it's going to take is for us to focus on the right problem to solve, and then we can solve it.
It's interesting. You look at companies that have interesting models, so many chief sustainability officers that, like, at one point were corporate social responsibility. And then, in the last 10 years, chief sustainability officers, some companies are still starting to make this a official part of the C-suite. And then there's other companies that, like Mars, for example, that have made their chief procurement officer and chief sustainability officer the same person, which is when you're tasked with being sustainable and buying and being like the lead buyer in the equation. I hope to see more of that happen, because I know there's so much frustration on the chief sustainability officer side of the equation because they need to move procurement, and procurement is driven by bottom line, right?
Right.
Right. So, yeah, I think in general, one of the things that I took away from being in front of your students as well is just like, how can we, you and I talked about this, how can we make supply chain sexy, right? Right? Like my idiot self 20 years ago that didn't realize how important supply chain procurement logistics was in solving the biggest challenges of the world. Like, how can we get that word out so that the best and brightest kids all over the world that want to make a difference realize that there's an avenue that doesn't get much more important?
Yeah, I love this question, and it's not chic. What excites my students, because what I love about this generation is I think they have high principles. They look at what's happening in the world and they want to do something about it. And what's great about the field of supply chain is if we do one thing good, we solve problems, as long as we're focused on the right problem. And so when I explain to them that supply chain is problem solving, and I give them examples of how, Amazon can ship a package in one day after you order it, or I talk about you go to a restaurant and you have seafood that's flown from halfway around the world that's fresh, they can connect the dots on how we solve problems. And so then we say, okay, now think about the things that matter to you, social justice issues, the environment. Now think about how these supply chains can solve problems, and then they work on these projects and they get super excited. So I think that's what these guys want to do. They want to make a good living, but they want to make a difference on the planet. And if there's any field that ties those two together, it's the field of supply chain.
And right now you're like Generation Z rock stars that I was in front of. Is that why they got into this? Did they have this realization?
Yeah, they get really excited about this. But again, they have to learn the techniques, right? They have to learn structured problem solving, and they learn how to get things done through other people. And I tell them, if you do that, you can do anything you want in the world. And I'm so excited about the possibilities of this generation.
Yeah, me too. And so many organizations out there that are, I was on the call with two of the biggest organizations that is dedicated to ocean-bound plastics supply chains in the global south today, like the two of the big ones. And, they have like these ecosystems inside. There's so many, like this whole idea of building vibrant supply chains in the global south is taken hold, but it's still the wild, wild west. It's really hard for a lot of these big companies to buy this recycled plastics that's being collected in Haiti and Nairobi. So much of it, I feel like one of my favorite stories, and you met Kieran Smith, who's one of our advisors from Mr. Green Africa in Nairobi, and he runs this huge waste collector cooperative. And Paul Pullman went down, the former CEO of Unilever, went down and visited his operation and was blown away. And then 2 weeks later, he had a deal with Unilever where they were making 100% recycled plastic from the community into dish soap. And it's like that, and that's part of like one of the things we're so bummed out about the pandemic is that these are the types of things that need to happen, and they need to happen in scale, because you get a CEO into one of these communities, then things happen pretty quickly, especially in operation like Kieran has down there. So, yeah, I get obviously pretty fired up about this too. Two guys from Baltimore that grew up about 10 minutes apart. We were probably usually talking a lot more about the Ravens than we are today. But man, Greg, I'm super excited to have you on, and in the Earth Report, and just in general, just love your work. Would love to have you back, and I think there's a lot of interest, and we just got to make supply chain sexy. Anything you want to say in close?
No, I love it. I love what you're doing. Like what you talked about in our class, you're a master networker, and we're going to need everybody on the boat, right? So what I love about what you're doing is let's don't create winners and losers. Let's don't create good guys and bad guys. Let's problem solve by bringing everybody together and figuring it out. And we will when we do. So thanks for everything that you're doing.
Game on. Thank you. We're doing our damnedest to get everybody on that boat. So I really appreciate it. And that is the Earth Report live today. Jack Buffington, thanks again. You can check out Peak. Go to Amazon.com for some advanced supply chain and order Peak Plastic, and it'll show up very soon. Anyway, thanks again, Jack.
Thanks, Dave.
All right. Take it easy.